Hello and welcome to the second video supplement to our class, Legal Aspects of Human Resources. I'm glad that many of you have found that the video is a useful tool for the class, so I'll continue making some of these as the course goes on. So there are just a few issues that I wanted to make sure that I covered in this video update. I wanted to make sure that I go over the distinction between a hostile work environment harassment that is protected under the law versus harassment that is not protected under the law. Also wanted to make sure I go through the NLRA with you as well as OSHA. Let's begin. So with a hostile work environment, many of you have done a really good job of being able to identify when there is a hostile work environment in the workplace. But I need you to be very careful about when you say that there is a hostile work environment under Title VII. Remember, Title VII only covers 5 protected classes. What are those protected classes? Remember, it's race, color, religion, national origin, and gender. Those are the only 5 protected classes. Now there are some other statutes that have been able to also use the hostile work environment framework. For instance, when there's intimidation or hostility toward a person on the basis of their age, and that person is age 40 and older, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act would come into play. That is a statute in where you could say that there's a hostile work environment under the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. Let's say that someone's being targeted because of their disability. Once again, we would be able to say there's a hostile work environment, but this time we would say it's under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it's really important to make sure that you have your statutes correct when you're looking at the various protected classes. But let's say that there's hostility and there's intimidation and there's harassment in the workplace, but we can't find a protected class. Well, guess what? That is the kind of harassment that's not prohibited in the workplace. As I said in the first video update, it's really important to understand that our employment laws do not protect against all workplace unfairness. So in the event that, let's say, a supervisor yells at all of his or her staff, well, that employer is definitely a harasser, but that employer may not be engaging in harassment that is prohibited under any of the statutes that we've covered. However, there was a really good case a few years ago that I will bring to your attention. There was a supervisor who did yell at his staff, and he was abusive. When he would go into meetings, he would pound on the table and he'd yell at people. But the only people he would yell at were the women, because he knew he could get away with it. He knew that the men might speak up or might actually punch him out. So as a result, he would only yell at the women. The courts were able to find that there was sufficient evidence to find that there was a hostile work environment on the basis of gender. So that's a good example of how, once again, we can have a hostile work environment with intimidating behavior, but it must be attached to a protected class. A protected class must be the motivating factor for that hostile work environment being created. Our last homework assignment, you guys did a really good job on finding and identifying the NLRA, the OSHA violations, and the hostile work environment that may have been present. So let's go through all 3 of those. Let's start with the hostile work environment first. Many of you did say that yes, that there was a hostile work environment with David yelling at his fellow coworkers. But once again, was that a hostile work environment, and was that harassment that was being motivated by any of the protected classes that we've covered? The answer is no. There was no protected class. So in that situation, yes, an employee might feel that he or she is being harassed. However, we could not say it is a hostile work environment that is prohibited under law. However, as a human resource manager, when you do find that there is poor employer relations, such as people yelling at each other, people cursing at each other, or engaging in behavior that is not conducive for the workplace, you as a human resource manager do have the right to be able to create policies that would ensure that there's camaraderie and civility in the workplace. The NLRA, that is the National Labor Relations Act, and that ensures that employees and employers understand their rights and responsibilities when it comes to unions. What are unions? Unions are collective bargaining units that ensure that employees are able to negotiate for better wages, that they're able to bargain for better benefits, as well as looking at safety hazards in the workplace. So many of you are probably wondering, well, why would anyone want to collectively bargain with their employees? Well, it's like that old saying, there's strength in numbers. When one employee goes to the employer regarding a complaint, all it is a complaint at that point. But when an employee is able to go to his or her employer with 12, 13, or 100 other employees, at that point it becomes an issue that the employer has to pay attention to. So that's what a union does. It provides and it creates an opportunity for employees to collaborate and work together to ensure that employers understand their concerns. So with employees, they do have a right to create a union in the workplace. However, they can't intimidate their fellow co-workers into doing so. Similarly, an employer has to be able to let an employee create a union. Many of you said, well, you wouldn't allow David to have a discussion about unions in the workplace. Now, even though employers can limit the employee's speech, you have to be careful. If that employer tells David that he's not allowed to discuss unions in the workplace, that employer would be violating the NLRA, unless that employer is also willing to do away with all talk that has nothing to do with the workplace. So in other words, when we walk into the office and we want to talk about our weekends, we want to talk about our dates with our boyfriends and our girlfriends, that is the kind of speech that the employer would have to ban. That would be a bit difficult, right? So as a result, what a lot of employers do is that they try to collaborate and they try to work with their employees to ensure that the employee is still able to talk about the union in the workplace, but not interfere with the work that's being done in the workplace. So that's where the NLRA comes into play. OSHA. OSHA is the Occupational Safety and Health Act. That is the act that makes sure that our air is breathable in the workplace, that there are no fire hazards. Many of you might not even really notice that there are all these exit signs within our workplaces. Those are to ensure that, once again, in the event of an emergency, that we would know how to exit a building. And that's all driven by OSHA. So what was the OSHA violation here? The OSHA violation in your last assignment may have been that if HR hadn't gotten involved, or if HR had gotten involved in the situation with David Crew, that we may not have had a standoff with David holding hostages. At that point, we had created an unsafe workplace for our employees, which would be an OSHA violation. So how do OSHA, the NLRA, and unions sometimes work together? Well, remember back in either January or February of this year, there was a major explosion at a fertilizer plant in Texas. Well, that fertilizer plant had engaged in a number of workplace violations over the years that had to do with employee safety. However, there hadn't been anyone from OSHA to inspect that place in years. Well, many people have speculated that the reason why people never complained was that, number one, there was no union, and number two, people were afraid that they may lose their jobs if the employer had to fix some of these employee hazards. So, as a result, these hazards continued for years, and no one did anything about them, and sadly, there was that explosion. If there had been a union, an employee may feel a little bit more empowered to speak up, not to the employer, but to their union. And their union would make the phone call to OSHA and make the complaint, and OSHA would then investigate. So that's how sometimes OSHA, the NLRA, and unions work together. So for this upcoming week, you have your first and your only midterm in this class. It's not a very difficult midterm. All you have to do is read the book and just apply many of the statutes that we've gone over so far. It's really heavily focused on making sure that you understand Title VII. Even though this is an online course and we don't meet once a week, I want you to feel as though I'm completely available to you. So if you have any questions about the material or what's expected, feel free to email me. So with that, I wish you a good week, and I will see you next week in the next video supplement.